Let's later now. The sham pine in there, and at the same time, the crane with the Lloyd's goings on spring never became to be proud to be on an arm of your bitches. And it words. With a vast how only met. With what he was of all other one. What in mind, well, damn no hand. Are you phrasing to pool eyes? He wiped his brow with the back of a weathered hand, nails black with tar. Da Gama nodded, eyes still cast forward. She must be. The waves will not wait, nor the stars. He was tall, this Vasco, firm of shoulder and gaze, as much a figure carved from legend as from flesh. The youngest son of Vasco da Gama. A nobleman and seasoned explorer, Vasco had salt in his veins and ambition in his blood. But it wasn't ambition for wealth alone. There was a fire in him, kindled by the tales of Prince Henry the Navigator, who decades earlier had charted the unknown west coast of Africa. It burned hotter now, with King Manuel on the throne and destiny spreading maps upon his tables. It had once been Bartolomeo Diaz who rounded the Cape of Good Hope just a few years prior, proving the ocean did indeed swing past Africa's deadly southern tip, but he turned back, beaten by storms, and eyes never glimpsed the eastern horizon. The king now needed a man not just to sail into the storm, but to continue through it, to reach the fabled shores of the Indian subcontinent and return with proof, a trade route that could bypass land caravans and bypass the Muslim and Venetian middlemen who choked European commerce. King Manuel I, ambitious, pious, and ever calculating, had summoned Vasco da Gama with a letter sealed in gold and gravity. It arrived on a rainy morning at his family estate in Signs. It was there not the body hand, him even having there a priest or manage a hermit. I don't really make it the made on you have an bit basic. Yeah, be well. You're okay, no, it. Or look, but one would talk. Are you afraid to go like says? It's making truly hands. No see well, with lay it was pretty deep. But don't like with your hand. If the top off the rooms, think the sleep around you can get. Next. So just right, buying what yeah. You know, really sorry for seeing that rebellion. Let's say, look, on 36 like the but not this the first. He rode to the royal court the very next day. The halls of the palace of Rapira swirled with 1,000 whispers as he strode through, noblemen arching eyebrows at the young knight from the southern coast, courtiers hiding smirks behind jeweled hands. King Manuel sat beneath an arched window, his robe embroidered with maritime sigils, anchors, ships, and crosses. Behind him hung a giant map of the world, part fable, part fact, the edges lined with dragons and angels, Africa a stretched enigma winding into the mist. "I've chosen you, Vasco," the king had said without preamble, "to lead this undertaking, to sail further than any before you, to crown Portugal's legacy with a path to India carved by your skill." Da Gama had bowed, not with the eagerness of ambition, but the control of a man weighing his place in history. "I accept, Majesty. May the stars guide us and your name last beyond kingdoms." Preparations began at once. Lisbon was transformed into a crescendo of purpose. The shipyards hummed like a clock wound too tightly, pulsing with saws, pulleys, and the low growl of laboring men. Silk maps from Alexandria, old Arabic sea charts, and inked diagrams from Jewish astronomers were unrolled in dark rooms lit by candlelight. Da Gama met nightly with scholars, cosmographers, and shipwrights, his ears burning with talk of winds, trade currents, and celestial alignments. The fleet was to consist of 4 vessels. The San Gabriel, commanded by Vasco himself, the San Rafael, to be captained by his brother Paulo da Gama, the Betrayal, a lighter caravel under the command of the grizzled Nicolau Coelho, and a 4th storage vessel to be captained by Gonzalo Nunez. "I want each hull inspected thrice," da Gama ordered one morning to his quartermasters, "casks sealed well enough to outlive the voyage. We cannot barter with rot." Down by the quay, families clustered to glimpse the rising giants of wood and sail. Children pointed at the billowing sails stitched in monasteries by careful fingers, white as prayer, bearing the red cross of the Order of Christ. Merchants waited behind stalls laden with cowrie shells, dried meat, and bolts of linen to sell provisions to any sailor with a handful of coin. Among the bustle, an old woman approached Vasco one evening, her hands calloused, shawl clutched tight. "Do you sail far, senor?" she croaked. Vasco paused. "As far as the sea is willing." She studied him for a long, piercing moment, her eyes like tide pools. Then she pressed something into his palm, a smooth, round stone, warm despite the breeze. "For luck," she whispered, and vanished into the crowd. The night before the voyage, as Lisbon slept, the expedition's corps gathered in final council. A makeshift altar had been erected in the captain's quarters of the São Gabriel, draped in crimson cloth and flickering with waxen light. They stood in silence. Vasco, Paulo, Coelho, and Nunes, men bound not by blood but by the fates of waves. "If we fail, we will be forgotten," said Paulo. Nicolau Coelho chuckled. "If we die, saints will remember us." Vasco did not smile. "We go not to gamble, but to gain. Not for ourselves, but for our king, our people, and our future. Portugal will no longer walk behind others. We will lead." Silence returned, heavy and holy. Outside, the tide crept up the stones like a beckoning hand. The dawn of July 8, 1497, came with golden light pouring over the terracotta roofs and cathedral spires. Bells rang like skipping hearts. Citizens spilled onto the harbor terraces in wave after wave. Flags raised high, prayers murmured, wine spilled in silent libations. In the palace, King Manuel himself blessed the fleet before the altar, oils of myrrh and cedar anointing the air. Da Gama, dressed in ceremonial tunic over sturdy chainmail, held the edge of his sword to the sun as priests chanted litanies in Latin. "Let the Lord chart your way between the stars and below them," one intoned. When Da Gama finally stepped onto the deck of the São Gabriel, the world itself seemed to hold its breath. Anchors coiled, ropes tightened, sails bloomed like wings. He raised one there. A wonder need to think this out. Rand, hooking the desire? And bringing full out. Repentant. What a rider. Are you facing get the says? It's making shape and flurry. The illing is sleekly was great age. That's wax so inclusive if the pots. Happy not you can get. So all I was like, yeah, really wisdom there, but the same departure from Lisbon. The morning of July 8, 1497 dawned like the overture to a great symphony. Settled at first, then swelling with sound, movement, and purpose, mist clung to the Tagus River like lace on velvet, veiling the harbor in ghostly reverence. A hush fell as the first light spilled across the tiled rooftops of Lisbon, but it would not stay quiet for long. Bells tolled, the chorus of iron and faith rang through the cobbled streets, pulling worshippers from before their wooden crucifixes and waking mothers whose sons would never sleep on land again. Drumbeats followed, slow and martial, relentless as a heartbeat beneath armor. Soldiers, merchants, clergy, and peasants gathered in droves, their eyes transfixed on the figures moving toward the water, those chosen to sail further than any soul before them. Vasco da Gama walked at the head of the procession. Clad in a dark cloak, modest yet noble, the admiral's eyes burned with a steady fire, an ember of ambition, not pride. His footsteps were restrained marches, each one thudding with the weight of nationhood. Beside him strode his brother, Paulo da Gama, pale with resolve, and Nicolau Coelho, whose easy smile belied the gravity of the morning. Together they moved as pillars of Portugal's hope. The fleet waited at anchor, their masts rising like forest trunks against the wide, waking sky. São Gabriel, the flagship, da Gama's ship, stood proud, a beast of timber and canvas crowned with the royal standard of King Manuel I. Beside her, São Rafael, a caravel piloted by Paulo, and the smaller Berrio nestled in ready support. A fourth, unnamed supply ship loitered behind, laden with food, water, weaponry, and all the dreams a sovereign could fit into barrels and rope. On the quay, people pressed together, noblemen in silks and chainmail, barefoot children clutching rosaries, widows-to-be blinking tears they refused to shed too soon. Priests raised their voices in Latin benedictions. An incense burner swung lazily, sending up fragrant tendrils as if trying to touch the sails themselves. "I confess," whispered Coelho to da Gama as they paused at the edge of the quay, "I expected more thunder and less incense for our baptism into the unknown." Da Gama's lips tightened slightly. "The thunder waits at sea. This is the silence before it." A bishop stood before the gangplanks, holding a gilded cross high. Around him gathered sailors and officers, some barely grown to manhood, others weathered by a dozen lesser journeys. They dropped to one knee. A low wind stirred the garments of altar boys. The bishop's voice cut through the hush. "May the Lord Almighty," he intoned, "light your path across the waters. May he lift your ships upon the waves as wings upon the wind. And should death find you, may it not find you empty of faith." A murmur of amen passed through the crowd, and crew alike, followed quickly by murmured farewells. Children clutched their fathers' calloused hands one last time. Sisters wept into soldiers' shoulders. A wife touched her husband's face, memorizing the warmth before it dissolved into sea fog. Da Gama said goodbye to no one. His family, of ancient lineage and noble blood, had already farewelled him 2 days prior in private chambers. He had chosen to wear stoicism as armor now. The time had come. With a nod from Da Gama, the bosuns barked commands. Crew members scrambled aboard, their movements swift and sure despite the trembling of uncertain futures. Ropes groaned as they were unfastened, sails unfurled with a beat like drums made from angel wings. The sea stirred like a beast stretching beneath its blanket of silver. São Gabriel was the first to edge from port, noses of its hull parting the morning tides. One by one the other ships turned seaward like birds remembering the sky. From the water, cries of the crowd blurred into a roar rising and falling like the breath of Lisbon itself. "Vasco!" someone cried from the quay. "Godspeed!" Another, "Bring back spice! Bring back glory!" And fainter still, "Come back to me!" Da Gama stood at the fore of the São Gabriel, his gloved hand resting lightly on the rail. He didn't wave, he didn't speak, but within him surged the voices of the men beside him and the invisible hand of the king behind him. By the time the last mast vanished behind the blue-gray horizon, the city had returned to its routines. But aboard the fleet, adventure had just begun. The first weeks passed in a strange rhythm, days of stillness, nights of sickness. The Atlantic was kind for a time, rolling in gentle waves, wind steady, if sometimes stubborn. The men adjusted to the creaking groan of timbers, the slap of water against hull, and the peculiar silence that came when land was memory only. Coelho scratched the back of his neck and said to Da Gama one morning, "I never realized how loud the sea could be until it stopped talking." And indeed, there were silences, long stretches where not even the gulls cried, and the horizon shimmered with illusions of cities and monsters that melted under closer scrutiny. The men gave these deception mirages names: the City of Crystal, the Floating Bride, St. Elmo's dinner table. Some prayed before them, others cursed. Celestial maps guided their path, stars became their new lighthouses. Da Gama, though reliant on his pilots, took to studying the night sky as if it held every answer he hadn't dreamed to ask back in Lisbon. He would often climb to the quarterdeck long after meals were done, where the wind was sharper and the sky wider. It was there that Paulo found him one twilight. Da Gama didn't look away from the constellation ahead, the Southern Cross rising like a promise. "Do you feel it?" he asked. "The pole?" Paulo followed his gaze. "What I feel is the salt in my beard and sores on my feet. But yes, I feel it." They were silent a moment, the only sound the occasional squawk of a pet parrot someone had snuck aboard. "It's strange," Paulo finally said. "Back home we were the farthest thing from free, but out here we are kings," Da Gama finished. "Kings of nothing, which makes us kings of everything." The laughter that followed between them was short but real, but the sea was no indulgent host. Storms rose unexpectedly, slicing daylight into chaos with black curtains of rain. Sails were torn, ropes snapped like bones, barrels rolled loose across decks. The men lashed themselves to masts and cursed Neptune in 10 languages. A sailor named Diego fell from the rigging during one such squall. His body vanished before it touched water, swallowed by the storm's open maw. They murmured prayers for him the next morning, but didn't dare slow their voyage. Food began to spoil, rats nibbled grain. A deckhand reportedly stepped on a loaf of bread and kissed its crust in apology before devouring it whole. Water stores were strictly rationed, salt pork became a currency. One man, delirious with pain from rotting molars, tried to jump overboard, crying about a sea maiden calling for him. 2 sailors tackled him, but he sobbed for hours, his cries haunting the hull. And yet many remained in high spirits. Why? Because they believed. They believed in the gold of Calicut, in the scent of cinnamon so rich it stained air itself. They believed their voyage was no mere travel, it was discovery. And more than that, it was deliverance from mediocrity, poverty, and obscurity. On the 35th night, Da Gama gathered his captains in the São Gabriel's cramped map room, candles flickering in nervous winds. "We have passed the Canary Islands, and the Cape Verde anchors just ahead," he declared, fingers tapping the dog-eared charts. "After that we strike south-southwest." "But not along the coast?" asked Coelho, surprised. "We take the Dias route deep into the open Atlantic," Da Gama confirmed. "Fewer natives, fewer winds, but also fewer landmarks. We trust the stars." Silence followed. Coelho exhaled slowly. "The crew will need reassurance. They fear oceans with no edges." Da Gama nodded. Then tell them this, we don't chase edges, we make them. And so the course was set. Lisbon was now as far behind them as India was ahead, a memory fading like sail on a distant horizon. Every rising sun brought unknowns, every wave a test. But the men of the fleet, bound together by salt, sweat, and scripture, pressed onward beneath the wheeling stars. They did not know it then.
Argue was I, when you should speak of the outcome some the re. It shows the particular information. Well, I do myself to beside just. Would you give you another comedy and things straight on? And I mean. But what I'm thinking, we can call us in the leakings when thinking of X could be in minus. And name did it die itself, triumphant, which I have realized that's the flute more like engage. For no vanity, I don't know about X. Just money. Who was destroying myself? What? So glory. Do this to get glory. Thing. Found strategy to this in job, and you has to it. So, I wonder, I know if you have one way, I really to go for one place. The favorite period will you lay slower than that. Now, I then had a lot of money. But I didn't give it on the spine higher. I wanted one part in rear. My boss would get gum. Just under from sound me, Betrayal stepped onto solid ground with a slow exhale that betrayed a hint of burden. The crew bustled with renewed energy. Water barrels were filled from mountain springs. Salted fish traded for dried fruits, and canvas adjusted or mended. Letters were penned in calloused hands, ink smudging over unspoken fears and longings as sailors poured their hearts into ink for the loved ones left behind, trusting strangers to carry these whispers homeward. It was in the hush of twilight, as the crimson sky bled into the folds of the sea, that Vasco summoned his trusted captains to a meeting aboard the flagship. The candlelight flickered over aged maps, one of which bore the annotations of the late Bartolomeo Diaz, brave pathfinder and cautionary tale. "We will not hug the African coast," da Gama said, his voice low but resolute. A muttering stirred the gathered men. Niccolo Quilau frowned. "But the coast admiral provides safe anchorage, points of trade, signs of life. Signs of danger as well," Vasco countered. He ran a finger across a drawn arc that curved boldly into the western Atlantic. "The Gulf of Guinea is cursed with calms and crosswinds. Dias learned this, nearly lost his soul to it. We shall slip wide, take the open sea, ride the southern winds, then return to the coast when it's safe." The silence that followed was not of agreement, but of reluctant admission. The stars would be their compass now, and the Atlantic, dark and vast, their only road. Within a day the fleet unfurled its canvas and left the safety of Cape Verde behind, slipping into that deep unknown. At first the wind was kind, full in the sails, and rich with salt. Whales breached at a distance, fountains in liquid symphony, and schools of flying fish scattered like silver flakes across the foam. The men sang shanties against the sea's lull, their spirits riding high. But dream-like days bled into nights, and weeks into something heavier, into a silence thick with longing. The ocean grew wider than any man's hope. No land in sight, not a bird, not a leaf floating on the waves, just sky and sea, a dome of muted blues stretching endlessly above and below. Cloudless days turned the deck into blistering griddles. The sun was merciless, beating down with such fury that shirts clung wetly to skin, and wooden hulls creaked in protest. "But you will up here, and you can see yourself and give more work of this time." Deep is it to thatched. Like well, we decided to the suck. Just to deal with you and my at hand of the I'm saying the when you listen to and I don't think to the to well say that. I was saying about what size didn't and hey that's I can see them on your place that's and that's man I didn't take you curious and be nice that's well for all this stage on I'm lost and I see you say you start you're you just was just trying to as long as I'm done I just want to the Lord is trying to play this just for the Lord's name the strength strength it is in design and the hash puts within stars like all in or I know if you anyone right doing that you got with voice and ever period will you learn or no now I but I put to the consequence of match ball into empowered into perhaps the precedent it was being since the ninth. The San Rafael nearly capsized one drear dawn, her sails snapping like thunder as the timbers trembled. Below deck men clutched each other, trapped in cabins that stank of fear and unwashed bodies. One sailor, dazed in fever, swore he'd seen angels flying in the storm. Another saw demons. Da Gama remained at the helm, sleep avoided, his fists clamped tightly to the brass rail of the quarterdeck. The sea scared him, how could it not? But fear was a luxury denied to captains, as the crew can command an iron figure beneath the surging sky, unwavering, with eyes like lit coals. When the storm at last withdrew, it left behind bruised sails and battered men, but also silence. Not peace, not calm. Silence. The food supplies, exposed and shaking in the moisture of the low holds, began to spoil. Mold claimed the wheat. The salted meat turned to foul paste.
Rats, once hunted for amusement, became desperate prey. And worst of all, the crew began to quarrel, not over faith, but bread. Men who once laughed together now eyed each other as rivals for the last orange or the final drop of vinegar-tainted water. One night, near what they guessed was their 12th week adrift, Antonio, a deckhand from Puerto, collapsed during his night watch. His gums were strangely swollen, and blood pooled in his mouth. The ship's barber diagnosed it grimly, scurvy, and then another fell, and another. From his cabin, Vasco da Gama watched through the circular stern window as the moonlight trailed lifelessly across the rippling surface. He wrote by a wavering lantern, 3 more buried to the sea, rations poor. The men grow restless, not mutinous yet, but close. I dream of land. I pray land dreams of us. It was on the 84th day that the lookout cried out like one resurrected, "Land, land to the southeast." At first none dared trust his voice, but as if the ocean herself grew weary of holding them prisoner, the shadows of coastline emerged, rough and jagged in the distance. A cheer rose across the fleet, weak but fervent, frenzied sounds of men clawing back hope. Tears, prayers, laughter, it spilled in equal measure. As they drew near, the men saw a landscape of cliffs and roiling surf. The Cape of Good Hope. The very name sounded mythic, like something conjured in fables, not meant for mortal sight. Here, many believed, the world's edge began, a place where storms circled to die and be reborn. The wind, however, offered no welcome. Days of ceaseless waves and crashing squalls tested them yet again, as if nature demanded one final price before granting safe passage. The sea heaved the ships with staggering violence, sails tore like parchment, decks flooded and yawed. Men tied themselves to railings, howling into the teeth of the wind. "We'll split upon the rocks," Coelho shouted. "Hard to starboard!" Da Gama roared back, sleeves ripped and soaked, hair lashed to his brow, but his voice born of fury and will. They fought the sea. They fought with cracked timber and blinding salt spray. They fought with the names of their hometowns on their tongues, with their mothers' prayers whispered into the hurricane, and somehow, they won. On a morning crowned by silence, the ships limped past the Cape's granite shoulders. The ocean shifted. The crew stood mute, staring at the calmer waters beyond. Vasco da Gama stood against the morning breeze, his cloak torn and soaked, but his spine tall. He breathed in the cool salt air, his voice low and rasped. "We have turned the Cape. Is this it?" Coelho asked beside him, following da Gama's gaze into the trembling blue. "No," rebutted the admiral, eyes narrow. "This is the gate. The east lies beyond. But we have earned our passage." And so they sailed on, battered, yes, but not broken. The winds blew differently now, warmer, as if the world, once doubt's dominion, now recognized them for what Rosdow, Feder, charting unknown waters. The sun had barely risen when the fleet, kissed red by the early dawn, slipped away from the storm-tossed Cape of Good Hope. Behind them lay Europe's edge and the ghosts of failed expeditions. Before them, endless uncertainty. The ocean stretched ahead like an unrolled scroll, its pages blank and waiting to be inscribed with legends. Vasco da Gama stood at the helm of the Salmibriel, his eyes steeled, one hand gripping the bearing compass as the salty wind toyed with the corners of his worn coat. Around him, his officers moved with practiced precision, though even the most steadfast among them stole silent glances at the waves, as if to ask whether they too could sense what loomed in the days ahead. For weeks the ships hugged the jagged belly of Africa's eastern coast, each inlet a discovery, every bay a question mark. The shoreline here was less merciless than the Atlantic, but no less mysterious. Occasionally smokes from distant fires betrayed unseen settlements in the brush, and dark figures on the cliffs watched with quiet curiosity or suspicion. Charts were drawn hastily, their edges smudged with the brine of the sea. Each pen stroke etched a fragment of the world anew. When the fleet arrived at Mozambique Island, they were greeted not with arrows but with incense and open arms. Muslim traders, richly robed and adorned with jewelry, descended from their dwellings and surrounded the Portuguese, their language spilling melodically into the air. The perfume of spices hung thick ground cinnamon, fresh coriander, burning myrrh. For a breathless moment, the men of Lisbon thought themselves embraced by fortune. "Salam alaikum," one of the elders said, reverently bowing before Vasco. Da Gama returned the gesture, murmuring quickly to Fernão Veloso, one of his interpreters. "They mistake us for Muslims," Da Gama muttered at the edge of his breath. "Let them think so, for now." Veloso nodded, replying with embellished gestures and broken phrases pieced together from Arabic and Spanish. The exchange was clumsy but serviceable. For a short while, trade commenced. The Portuguese offered red cloth, bells, iron tools, and hand mirrors. In return, they accepted fresh fruit, camphor, strange oils, and stories of lands beyond and ports crawling with wealth. But the spell did not last. Word seeped from the lips of a Swahili merchant, whispers that the newcomers bore not the Koran but crucifixes, that behind their courtly words lay foreign intent. The tone of conversation shifted, invitations dwindled, eyes narrowed, and the city's smiles became masks stretched taut over skepticism. One dusky night, as the ships bobbed gently in the harbor, a warning came. "They plot to take you, Captain," said a sailor named João Serrão, breathless and ash-colored. "I overheard 2 men speaking near the well. They say the Sultan grows wary. He speaks of chaining us, of taking the vessels for himself." Da Gama said nothing at first. The lantern's flame flickered between them, casting long shadows across the palmwood decks. Then, slowly, his jaw set. "Ready the guns," he said. "Send word to the Saint Raphael and the others. We depart with tomorrow's tide, quietly. No salutes." Like specters, they slid from the port before sunrise, leaving behind baskets of produce, confused traders, and a rising tension that might yet explode in their wake. As silvery waves swallowed Mozambique's coastline, Da Gama stood silent, only speaking once they were safely beyond cannon reach. "They see us as strangers now," he said to Nicolau Coelho, captain of the Barrio. "From here forward, we must tread as carefully as we sail. One misstep, and the sea won't be our only enemy." Northward they journeyed, up the curve of Africa's eastern shore. The ocean was cruel in a new way, not with storms, but with an eerie stillness that baked their decks and sapped their tempers. The men grew restless, mutters rose with the heat. They were thousands of miles from Lisbon, and the idea of India, so full of promise, remained frustratingly intangible. March brought them to Mombasa. Unlike Mozambique, Mombasa greeted them with iron beneath its silks. From the harbor, the city shimmered with opulence, whitewashed mosques, arched palaces, towers carved with moonstones, and harbors brimming with foreign craft. But the welcome was stone cold. The local sheikh sent a cautious emissary, draped in the greens and golds of Islamic fashion. His words were veiled pleasantries, his questions sharp as daggers. "What news from Egypt?" he asked in Arabic. "We come not from Egypt," Da Gama answered through Veloso, "but from Lisbon. We seek trade and friendship." The emissary's brows furrowed. "Lisbon? Then you are not of Islam?" "No," Da Gama said, and the silence that followed was thick as cannon smoke. Their ships were monitored. Supplies came slowly, loaded by laborers who watched every move. Rumors reached them of planned ambushes, of alliances between Arab merchants determined to drive the Portuguese back to the sea. The sailors slept with daggers under their cloaks. After 5 days of growing unease, Da Gama convened his officers in the cramped captain's cabin. "We leave tonight," he announced, his voice edged with iron. "No trade is worth suspicion shadowed by betrayal." With sails dark against the moonlight and the creak of ropes loud in the hush of evening, the fleet again turned away, retreating not in defeat, but in calculated withdrawal. Still, Mombasa had taken its toll. The men muttered of curses and jinxed waters. Doubt crept aboard like barnacles on hulls. But then came Malindi. The port of Malindi appeared almost mirage-like after the tension they had endured. A haven of peace, the city sat cradled by sun-bleached sands and coconut palms that swayed in harmony with the sea. A sultan, draped in fine indigo robes, greeted them on the docks. His smile was genuine, his curiosity equally so. "You are Christians?" he asked. "We are," Da Gama said, "but not conquerors. We seek your friendship and a path to India." His honesty paid dividends. The Sultan, wizened and pragmatic, saw in Da Gama an opportunity, new trade possibilities, a distant ally, perhaps even leverage in his own feuds with rival ports. It was in Malindi, under a canopy of stars, that Vasco da Gama met the man who would guide him across the Arabian Sea, a navigator named Ahmed ibn Majid. Legend defined him as a sage of the ocean, a cartographer of winds, and a whisperer to the stars. He walked with measured steps and spoke little, but when he did, it was like listening to the tide explain itself. "Monsoons will begin to shift soon," Ahmed murmured, his fingers tracing constellations on a faded map. "You must ride the wind as a hawk rides a current. Delay a week, and the sea will turn its face from you." Da Gama watched the man's hands, weathered, ink-stained, full of memory. He nodded slowly. "I place our fate in your stars," Vasco said. Ahmed smiled thinly. Better to place it in discipline. The stars guide only those who listen. In the final days at Malindi, the ships were cleaned and caulked. Barrels were filled with dried meat, stale biscuits, and casks of rainwater. Relations with locals deepened, crafts were exchanged, and laughter returned cautiously to the decks. Some sailors found lovers on the shore, moments of gentleness in a long voyage of severity. Then, one golden morning, with seabirds wheeling above and prayers offered in both Portuguese hymns and Arabic proverbs, the sails unfurled again, bound for India. Past coral reefs and turquoise shoals, away from the Horn of Africa, the fleet moved like a procession of dreams, seeking fulfillment, pushed by monsoonal winds, pulled by centuries of longing. As the coast slipped away behind them, Da Gama stood once more at the prow. The sea stretched before him in hues of violet and jade, trembling with possibility. Eastward, he whispered, toward the true test, and with the whisper of sails and the groan of wood, the Portuguese Jopot landfall in Calicut. The Arabian Sea stretched seemingly forever, a vast, undulating mirror of restless waves and brooding clouds. For weeks, the Portuguese fleet had battled monsoonal storms that whipped the sails and tossed the wooden hulls like toys. Ocean spray stung the skin like needles, and the winds tore at clothes and resolve alike. Rations grew stale, water brackish. The gnawing hope of land, of India, was all that kept the muttering crew from slipping into despair. Vasco da Gama stood amid the creaking boards of the San Gabriel, his knuckles white around the railing as he squinted into the horizon. Salt crusted his beard, and months of hardships etched themselves in the lines around his eyes. But there, beyond the lifting swell, gleamed a sliver of shore. Land. India. "Land ahead!" cried a lookout from the crow's nest. A wave of relief surged through the ship, more powerful than any storm they had faced. Men stumbled out from the holds, some bare-chested and gaunt, others still clutching rosaries. They leaned over rails, staring wide-eyed at the distant coastline rising slowly from the horizon. Calicut, a name whispered like a holy place in the royal court of Lisbon, now it shimmered before them, real and solid. Palms fringed the coast, and whitewashed buildings gleamed in the midday heat, clustered like oyster pearls beneath the hills. The scent of shore wafted across the sea, the mingled smells of spice, roasted fish, incense, and smoke. For the weary Portuguese, it was a smell as divine as heaven itself. By May 20th, 1498, anchors were dropped with a great groan of chains, and longboats were lowered with care. The shore beckoned. Da Gama chose his finest men to accompany him on the first landing. His brother Paulo, ever by his side, joined along with interpreters, including a captive Arabic speaker who might bridge their words with the foreign tongue. Gifts had been prepared, bolts of cloth, bells, coral beads, basins of copper, combs, and small mirrors. Simple trinkets, heavy in hope. When Vasco's feet first touched the white sands of the Malabar coast, he knelt silently. No priest had yet blessed the soil, but he bowed his head nonetheless. "India," he whispered, tasting the word like honey and steel on his tongue. "We have found her." They were led to the city by curious locals whose dark eyes and bare, tanned chests showed equal parts interest and caution. Calicut, Kozhikode, as the people called it, was alive with color and motion. Open-air markets teemed with silks, monkeys on leashes, baskets of saffron, and ivory combs. Elephants paraded under canopies of gold-threaded cloth, while Brahmins chanted in rhythms unfamiliar and ancient. "Behold," murmured Paulo, nudging his brother, "a city richer in sound than silence ever could be." Yet the splendor was not unmixed with tension. Word of the fleet's arrival had reached the Arab merchants who dominated the spice trade of the port. Their influence ran deep with the Zamorin, one ruler of Calicut, and they sensed a threat in the pale-skinned newcomers from the far west. "Let them come, let them give their offerings," one merchant muttered in Arabic to his companions. "We shall see what treasures these Franks believe can purchase pepper." The emissaries from the fleet approached the Zamorin's court, crossing tiled courtyards perfumed with myrrh and sandalwood oil. Thick pillars supported high domes, where peacocks wandered unfazed. The hall of the Zamorin was grand and cool, floor covered in woven carpets from Persia, and walls inscribed with Vedic motifs. Gold glistened in the polished toe rings of attendants and the brass lamps that flickered in the shade. Vasco da Gama bowed deeply before the ruler. The Zamorin sat upon a raised platform adorned with garlands and a silken robe the color of saffron. His face, calm yet unreadable, regarded the newcomers with academic curiosity, tempered by centuries of foreign dealings. Through the interpreter, da Gama spoke. "We come in peace, noble lord," he said. "We are men of the West, sent by our king, Manuel of Portugal. We seek only friendship, and to trade as equals with your great city." The gifts were laid before the throne, modest by local standards. The court murmured. The Zamorin's high priest leaned forward and voiced what many were thinking. "Is this all that your king sends in hopes of earning favor? Coral beads, trinkets?"
You come from so far to cross the world to barter with baubles?
Da Gama felt his cheeks warm, but he stood firm. "We have endured much to reach your lands." The sea did not part easily. The Zamorin, to his credit, did not refuse the gifts outright. He gestured for them to be accepted as a gesture of courtesy. Yet in his eyes lay a glimmer of bemusement, a ruler unsure if this man truly grasped the wealth and power of India. News of the Portuguese spread like wildfire. Crowds assembled at the docks to glimpse the foreigners. Some cheered, others gawked and spat. The Arab traders grew bolder, casting hostile glances whenever Vasco or his men passed through the markets. One evening, as the fleet's supplies were restocked, an older Arab merchant approached Paulo da Gama. "You come too late," he said coldly. "For over 100 years we have ruled these routes. We bring gold from Africa, silk from China, incense from Arabia, and now you sail here with empty hands and open mouths." Paulo looked him in the eye. "Perhaps, but the tides change, as do the winds." Tension mounted. Rumors reached da Gama's ears that the Arabs had tried to sway the Zamorin into detaining the Portuguese as spies or pirates. Their ships, floating alien and wooden on the tide, were watched by many eyes. The temperature of diplomacy cooled with each passing day. Still, da Gama persisted. He requested a formal trading license. Audience after audience at court followed each, filled with subtexts and veiled meanings. After considerable delay, the Zamorin finally relented. "You may trade," he declared, "but you must leave part of your cargo as assurance, and we shall see if your ships return, if your king is truly a prince of men, or merely the captain of beggars." Da Gama agreed, though unease weighed on his shoulders. His estimation of the mission's success shifted with the tide. They had made contact, but not yet secured their future. Then, one morning, he stood by a merchant's stall and watched as pepper was weighed, carefully, reverently, and in silence. The merchant lifted a sack to reveal the dark, granular treasure, its scent rising like incense. "So this is it," said Vasco, half to himself. The merchant smiled, not understanding his tongue, but recognizing the reverence in his tone. It was then that da Gama knew this voyage, this harrowing passage through fire and water, had found reward, not merely in gold or favor, but in the great loop completed, Europe's first handshake with India across the sea. Their ships' holds were loaded with spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves. Contracts, fragile though they were, had been signed. Local traders, curious and independent of the Arab scorn, bartered with the foreigners gladly. Eventually, the monsoon winds began to shift. Danger loomed in remaining too long. The fleet, though bolstered by prizes, remained vulnerable, far from home and outnumbered in these alien waters.
Because they a team pung hard before we underage. More would I can do the dwarf. But the Zamorin, perhaps swayed by his Muslim advisers, began to show reluctance toward the Portuguese presence. A quiet but urgent council was held aboard the São Gabriel. "We must be ready," Paulo said, his brow furrowed. Their smiles broke colder. "The tide that welcomed us now grips us by the ankles." "But we have succeeded," Vasco insisted. "Not completely, not without scars, but we have done what no European has done. We have opened the door." They weighed anchor as May spilled into June. Calicut receded behind them, its temples and towers fading into mist. The men were not who they had been. Salt and sun had aged them, but their eyes carried a glint of triumph. They had crossed a world. They had stood on India's shores. History had taken root in sandalwood soil. As the coastline dissolved into horizon once more, Vasco da Gama stood at the helm, his coat flapping like a banner in the wind. He spoke to the ocean. "You saw us come, and now you shall see us go, but we will return." And the sea, ever ancient, did not Gox is din ugauda, winning poverty.
When they turned their bows westward at last, there was no celebration, only a grinding silence broken by the relentless crash of waves. The return had begun. It did not take long for the ocean to turn its back on them. Less than a fortnight out, as they ventured once again into the Arabian Sea, the winds betrayed their charts. Storms churned with ferocity, driving the ships off course, splitting the fleet's cohesion. Night after night, black skies swallowed the masts as lightning flashed across the heavens like God's impatient wrath. The sea, which had once offered resistance, now seemed intent on revenge. In the mess quarters aboard the Sound Gabriel, silence reigned. The laughter that once echoed over shared bowls of dried beans and fish had faded into coughing fits and murmured prayers. Men were quieter now, hollow-eyed, many clutching their bellies or bleeding gums. The fresh fruit was gone. The salted meat turned putrid in the hold. Scurvy was upon them. Pedro Alvarez, a lean sailor from Porto, laid on the deck with his back against a barrel, skin yellowing, hands trembling. "My teeth," he whispered as da Gama approached. "They feel like glass, Admiral, ready to shatter." Da Gama crouched beside him, offering the last piece of dried orange rind they'd kept for emergencies. "Hold on, Pedro, we'll soon reach Malindi," he lied gently.
The sailor stared past him, into a dream. The spice weighed more than gold, but gold does not heal.
The Admiral rose, biting his tongue. The officers met that evening in the captain's quarters, their faces hollow, their eyes too tired for fear.
"We've lost 12 since yesterday," reported Nicolau Coelho, da Gama's trusted captain and friend. "Another 20 are too weak to man the sails."
"And we are not even halfway," someone murmured.
Outside, ocean winds howled, as if mockingly echoing the sentence. Da Gama struck the map with the butt of a dagger.
"We press on. The route south will take us past the coast of Africa. We stop in Malindi for supplies. For God's mercy, pray the currents carry us there intact." Weeks passed, each one wearing at the frame of ship and man alike. Time became irregular, marked only by deaths and the lowering of wrapped corpses into the depths, the sailors' voices cracking through requiem hymns. Once taught men forgot dates. They counted in wings, in stars, and in the groans of the dying. Then, at long last, a call rang out. "Land! Land to the west!" Men surged to the sides, thin hands clutching rails, lips trembling with disbelief. A dark line across the sea. Trees. Shore. Malindi. It was no mirage. The Sultan of Malindi had not forgotten his strange visitors. The small fleet of canoes greeted them with fruit, fresh water, and concern. Upon seeing the state of the crew, he sent physicians and herbs. One elder even boarded the Sound Gabriel, clucking his tongue at the swollen limbs and pale faces. "You wandered far from God's warmth," he said in broken Portuguese, "and now the sea bites back." Da Gama clasped the old man's hand. "We have wandered into her heart and survived." He stayed ashore 3 days. Under sun-dappled palms, he measured the time not by loss but by healing. The sickest were laid beneath linen tents. The stronger helped to clean filth from the bilges. Morale crept back, like a tide returning slowly to worn sand. On the final dusk, as the sails were refastened, the Sultan himself came to bid farewell. "You will not find the sea any kinder this time," he warned. "It still lies between you and your king." Da Gama bowed, eagle eyes fixed on the floor. "Perhaps. But I know now it can be crossed." The voyage around the Cape of Good Hope proved a test more severe the second time. Rounding it westward meant facing headwinds and treacherous waves. The ships pitched like toy boats. One vessel nearly broke her mast. The sea sprayed salt in their wounds, howling like a jealous old god unwilling to let them go. Men tied themselves to the rigging when sleep threatened to throw them overboard. The decks had not dried in weeks, slick with brine and despair.
Da Gama stood every watch, refusing to retreat to his cabin. "What kind of leader rests when his men are dying?" he asked the steward, who begged him to sleep for even an hour. "You'll fall where you stand," the boy protested.
"I'll fall closer to Portugal," then came the grim reply. Then one morning, gray and unchanged from the dozens before it, there came a break in the wind. The sky lightened. The waves grew rhythmic. A seabird circled overhead, screaming joyously. They had passed the Cape. There was no cheer this time, only relief. By the time they reached the western coast of Africa, the Betrayal had nearly splintered apart. The storeship had long been scuttled. Of all that had set out from Lisbon over a year before, only 2 seaworthy vessels remained, and even these bore the scars of war, weather, and godless fortune. The men, less than half. Yet each soul aboard knew something no maps had taught them. They had breached the oceans not just in body, but in reach. There was no more edge of the world. They had kissed it and returned. As the coastline of Portugal finally emerged from the horizon haze, the skies over Lisbon bloomed gold with evening fire. The sails caught the light like parchment set aflame. Tears filled Da Gama's eyes. He said nothing, only removed his battered cap and pressed it to his chest. Behind him, the crew moved to the prower. Some carried locks of friends' hair, taken before death. Others bore letters for widows. Cannons thundered from the shore. Church bells rang until the gulls scattered. Thousands stood at the docks. Families, priests, nobles, strangers, all straining for a glimpse of sails that had become legend. A woman wailed a name. A mother held her child up high, pointing to the line of ships. "Look, my son, the sea gave them back." The admiral stepped onto Portuguese soil with sore feet and a straight spine. Messenger boys dashed past, shouting through the streets, "India, da Gama has returned." Later that night, under candlelight in the royal palace, King Manuel read the parchment da Gama had clenched since Calicut, the document that held a different world between its folds. The king said nothing for a long time, only touched the coarse grain of foreign spices laid upon the table. Then quietly, reverently, the oceans belonged to Portugal now. But da Gama, standing apart from the sycophants and scroll readers, looked past the walls. He could still feel the storm in his bones, still hear the prayers of dying men, still see the coast of India rising over pre-dawn. Asjal Samem returned to Portugal, and heroes welcome. The winds that once carried them to distant shores had turned cold and weary on the return. The creaking hulls of the battered ships groaned like old men recalling battles long past. Men stood upon warped decks, hollow-eyed shadows of the crew that had departed over a year ago. What was once a fleet of potential and hope had returned bruised by the will of the ocean, but it had returned. Lisbon's horizon appeared at first as a line between sky and memory. When the towers and rooftops finally emerged from the haze, the air aboard the São Gabriel thickened with emotion. Some wept, others fell to their knees. Vasco da Gama, gaunt yet unbroken, stood at the prow in silence. Behind him, in the salt-crusted hold, lay barrels of spices, pepper, cloves, cinnamon, worth more than their weight in silver. Around him, fewer than 100 men remained, where once there had been over 170. The ships limped into the Tagus River, sails frayed, sails which had once flared proudly in the sun. Word spread through the port like sparks in dry brush. "They have returned! India has been reached!" Bells swung wildly, sending joyous clamor into the air. Fishermen dropped their nets, townsfolk left their stalls, noblemen halted their carriages mid-street. The ships had been gone so long many feared they'd been swallowed forever by the ocean. Now, like ghosts turned flesh, they arrived triumphant. King Manuel I himself descended to the water's edge, flanked by courtiers dressed in velvet and gold-threaded cloaks. Churchmen followed, chanting solemn hymns as banners bearing the cross of Christ fluttered in the breeze. A hush fell as the gangplank was lowered. The admiral stepped ashore. Da Gama's face was sun-worn and lined from suffering, but his spine remained iron. His tunic, though once regal, was patched. His boots bore water stains from storms blown over continents, and yet he walked forward with the gravity of one who had tilted the world. The king embraced him, not ceremoniously, but tightly, like a brother. To all who witnessed it, in that single embrace, centuries of ambition had been fulfilled. "Welcome home, Vasco," Manuel whispered, his voice thick. "You have pierced the horizon." The court erupted into cheers. Cannons thundered from the battlements as if to declare war on oblivion itself. The bells of Hieronymus Monastery, frozen in silence for funerals and famines, sang with life. Flower petals rained from balconies. Women wept into their shawls. Children danced barefoot, unaware of the blood and storm that had earned this celebration. A grand procession wound through the cobbled streets to the royal palace. Vasco da Gama rode through the city not in pompous glory, but in the quiet awe of a man who had faced the brink and returned. His expression carried both the weight of the dead and the fire of the mission completed. At the palace, days of feast followed. Minin lamak, olden platters overflowed with fruits and roasted game, and goblets of red Douro wine clinked in endless toasts. Dancers spun under candlelit chambers. Musicians strummed lutes and sang of ships and heroes. Nobles leaned in to hear tales of eastern courts, of spices weighed like rubies and merchants in silken robes. But it was no paradise, da Gama warned, sitting beside the king one evening, his voice low and steady. The journey took more lives than I care to count. My brother Paulo died before we passed the Cape. He was buried at sea, beneath stars foreign to us. Many others did not even make it home to die in their own land. Manuel nodded solemnly. And yet the road is open now, thanks to your courage. And our suffering? Vasco replied. Let that not be forgotten. But ambition tempered grief in the hearts of rulers. At a special court held days later, the king formally bestowed upon Vasco the title Admiral of the Seas of India. His coat of arms was revised, now bearing a golden cross rising from waves beneath a celestial star, a tribute to both divine guidance and eternal waters. News of the voyage spread beyond Portugal's borders with breathtaking speed. The courts of Castile and Aragon scrambled to understand its implications. Venice's merchant princes wrung their hands, sensing tremors in their spice monopoly. Even in Rome, the Pope himself dispatched envoys to Lisbon to inquire personally with the man who had connected Christendom by sea to the fabled Orient. Meanwhile, jealously burned, some whispered that da Gama's mission had been more violent than valiant, that he had returned not just with cargo and tales, but with the stiffness of a conqueror's conscience. But for most in Portugal such whispers were drowned beneath waves of national pride. "At what cost," asked a friar in the cathedral, "do we buy the world?" But few wished to count the coins of blood. They smelled the cloves, saw the bolts of Indian cotton, the glittering gemstones, and they dreamed. Yet for Vasco, amidst the cheers and songs, shadows lingered. He often walked the shores alone, boots sinking into sand as he stared out at the waters that had taken half his crew. In private he kept Paulo's rosary and whispered prayers in Swahili he had learned in Malindi. He was not the man who had left Lisbon. That version had been smelted and reshaped by storms, sickness, and stranger lands. One morning a merchant approached him. "My Lord Admiral," the man said, bowing low, "my ships follow routes you discovered. My family will prosper for generations because of your courage. I owe you my future." Vasco smiled politely, but said only, "What you owe me, pay forward to those who sail after." The sea had changed him. He no longer viewed riches as reward, but as burden. Wealth was weighty. It demanded wars, treaties, more voyages, wax. The door he had opened would usher in missionaries, but also cannons, bridges, but also chains. Still, he could not deny the satisfaction of having done what others had only dared imagine. The map now bent around his signature. The path to India was no longer myth. It had shape, direction, wind, and water. In later months the nation organized exhibitions of the journey. A full-sized replica of the São Gabriel was constructed in the royal square, complete with mock sails and crew in costume. Crowds thronged to see the black pepper and silk, to touch the strange wood of sandal, and hear tales from grim-faced survivors. Children were named Vasco in every corner of the country. The poet Luis de Camões, just a child then, would grow with stories of da Gama's passage swirling in his imagination, a seed that would one day bloom into the Lusíads. But at the voyage's heart, beyond public adulation, remained a tale of endurance, of men folding maps by starlight, of sails tattered by rain sent in from the Indian coast, of hostile ports where words failed and swords replaced meaning. It was not glory that had kept them alive, but resolve, bond, and the compulsion to reach the edge and go beyond. As his fame swelled, Vasco remained distant from indulgence. The king tempted him with estates and offices, and he accepted them, but visited rarely. He preferred the sea air, even when it stung. "The city praises you," his mother once said, wrapping his weathered hands in hers. "The city never knew the ocean," he replied softly. "It praises echoes, not the voice." And so da Gama lived in the paradox of a hero, haunted by the very feat that defined him, celebrated, yes, but never again the same. Lisbon had welcomed him back with open arms, but it was not the same world he returned to. It had tilted on its axis. Trade routes shifted, empires seeded, ambitions ignited across Europe. History now followed a new current, and far from Portugal's shores, in marketplaces from Calicut to Calicut, the name Vasco da Gama began to echo, not just as the man who came, but as the symbol of all who would follow. It had begun as a journey. Now, Krasazjau, Zeven, the world transformed. The sails had long since come down. The turbulent winds that had once guided wooden hulls across alien waters settled into memory. But the echoes of that voyage, the voyage that began when Vasco da Gama set course for India, reverberated across the continents like the tolling of some cathedral bell, never ceasing. His ships returned to Portugal, burdened not only with spice, but with a new axis around which the world would turn. Lisbon, once the starting point of dreams, had become their destination, and within its castles and counting houses a fever began to spread, an uncontainable hunger for more. No longer was the East just a tale spun by Venetian traders or illuminated in obscure Arab scrolls. It was real, reachable, and teeming with riches. Da Gama's journey had not merely linked Europe and India by sea. It had cracked the very shell of the known world. It began subtly, like the quiet shift of a tide before a storm. In the wake of da Gama's return, Portuguese merchants gathered in sun-drenched wine-houses and shouted giddily over cups of red duro. Pepper spice worth more than gold! Can you believe it? They spoke not in whispers but in declarations, eyes alight with the promise of fortune. Shipwrights' hammers clanged from dawn to dusk. Churches bristled with the faithful praying for safe voyages. The Tejo River gleamed with the reflections of ever-embarking ships, each one following the course da Gama had carved through salt and stars. But the change was not confined to Portugal alone. In Venice, silk-robed patricians clenched their fists as their monopoly over eastern trade routes began to erode. Genoese merchants murmured of Portuguese arrogance. In Istanbul, courtiers of the Sultan studied maps, anxious that a new power was threading through the back door of their empire. In distant India, whispers filled the halls of sultans and maharajas alike, strange men from the west, pale-skinned, steel-clad, demanding trade in the name of a king whose name they could barely pronounce, Manuel. And in Calicut, where da Gama had first stumbled into this new world with his ragged fleet and inadequate gifts, the Zamorin paced under carved wooden archways, scenting not cloves but the copper-sharp tang of challenge. The seas, once their private avenue for trade with Arab and Persian allies, now echoed with the creaking of foreign ships. A transformation was underway, one visible in steel, spice, blood, and ink. The star maps that once served only to guide mariners now multiplied, redrawn feverishly by cartographers whose quills scratched over fresh parchment with burning urgency. For every cape, every coast da Gama's fleet had charted, symbols were etched and legends created. Latin script danced beside Arabic names, errors abounded, and yet the maps, that curious blend of guesswork and ambition, spread across Europe like wildfire. One such map fell into the hands of a young man standing at a port in Seville. He traced the coast of Africa with a finger roughened by sea salt. "So it's true," he whispered. "India by sea." His name was Hernando, and in his veins surged the same fever that once burned through Vasco da Gama. He would not be the last. Adventurers, sailors, merchants, and mercenaries each took the sea lanes da Gama had opened and made them their own. And with every voyage the world's boundaries dissolved a little further. With trade came dominion. The Portuguese crown saw more than commerce in the east. It saw a realm to be ruled. Fortresses rose where da Gama had once bartered. Stone bastions now stood against the surf, flying the flag of the armillary sphere above ramparts lined with cannon. Men clad in mail shouted orders in a tongue the locals did not know, demanding allegiance, gold, and God. Soldiers followed merchants, missionaries followed both. The cross came upon mastheads, not always gently. In Goa, a local prince sat on a carved stool of sandalwood, listening as a missionary named Father Francisco insisted on the superiority of his Christ over the local gods. The prince's face remained unreadable as drums beat behind them, and jasmine blossoms drifted on the evening air. "Is this the path your captain brought?" the prince asked. The priest nodded solemnly. He opened the sea so faith could walk. But it was not only faith. Guns walked with it, and so did disease and arrogance and wonder. The transformation Vasco da Gama had sparked was no saint's tale. It was one of complexity, of creation and destruction dancing in a single flame. In the spice markets of Lisbon, saffron mingled with cinnamon, and the foreign became familiar. Indians, Malays, Chinese, all began to appear in Europe's towns and ports, some as guests, many as curiosities. They brought with them stories of strange lands, gods with elephant heads, and palaces carved from mountain faces. Exoticism turned the gears of economy and imagination equally. Yet far from Portugal and her golden harbors, consequences mounted. In Ethiopia, priests warned of rising tensions near the coast. In Arabia, traders cursed the West's interference. In Gujarat, merchant guilds convened to discuss how to preserve their place in a changing tide. And in the Indian Ocean, once a shared community of maritime cultures, conflict crackled like lightning trapped in a sail. The seas had once divided men but now connected them, sometimes in kinship, more often in conquest. Years later, in the shadowed halls of a university in Paris, a scholar addressed his students. Before da Gama, the world was a mosaic of isolated domains. After him, a tapestry. Woven not without blood, but woven nonetheless. The hall was silent, save for the scratching of quills. The scholar looked out the window at the river Seine flowing quietly beyond. He proved what no mere myth could, that oceans could be roads. And once roads, no gatekeeper could keep them closed. In palaces and ports, in monasteries and war camps, another truth settled. Empires were no longer built on land alone. And still the voyage echoed. Centuries passed, but the marvel of da Gama's route endured. His bravery, at times brutal, had reshaped minds as much as maps. He became more than a man. He became myth, a name uttered in 100 languages, etched into marble plinths, stamped onto coins, and whispered into school-child ears. A sailor, no, a shadow, muttered one Indian poet hundreds of years later as he penned verses of love and loss forged in the fires of conquest. He dipped his reed pen into ink dark as storm clouds and wrote, "The foreign sails arrived like judgment. They opened the world and closed our peace. Not all transformations breed only wonder. Some birth sorrow." Vasco da Gama's voyage lit the flame of global integration, but that flame did not distinguish between temple and market, between priest and pirate. It lit the path and the fuses. The Portuguese would not be the only ones to follow. The Dutch, the English, the French. One by one, they traced that lonely path along the curve of Africa, around the Cape, and into the East. A single voyage had become a procession. And yet the grandeur remained, not merely in gold, but in the audacity of it all. Whispers of da Gama traveled across classrooms and cockpits, across railroads and routers. People launched missions into the stars now, sailing not waves but voids, and still they spoke of da Gama. He looked out at the sea and saw a question. Then he went to find the answer a modern astronaut would one day say before stepping into the silence of outer space. The unknowns had changed. The courage, it had a familiar flavor. On the shores of Cochin, centuries after he breathed his last, a child played in the tide beside a stone monument that bore his name in smooth Portuguese script. A fisherman passed by and pointed to the statue. "You see him?" he said. "He came from across the sea. Long ago. He changed everything." The child looked out to the blue horizon, the sun setting gold upon it. "Will more come?" "Oh, yes," the man smiled. "More always come, and thus the voyage never ends. The world da Gama transformed continues to turn faster, louder, more entangled than ever. But trace the threads back, and you find him there, standing on a Villaradu, a legacy sculpted by the seas. The peasy grove sings in summer, and Lisbon never truly slept. Even at twilight, the scent of tar and salt hung in the air, mingling with the flickers of torchlight and the heavy creak of timber hulls in slumber. Vasco da Gama stood there once more, not as a man preparing for an uncertain voyage, but as one returned, older, wearier, and burdened now by more than water and wind. It had been 5 years since his triumphant return, 5 years of adulation, courtly honors, and political ceremony. Streets had echoed his name, children born were christened Vasco in reverence, and the royal court gifted him titles gilded with ambition. Yet within his eyes remained a shadow, etched not by triumph, but by the haunting knowledge that his legacy was not yet written. "There is still work to be done," he had told King Manuel I during a quiet audience beneath the vaulted ceiling of the Ribeiro Palace. "Our presence in India is a whisper, Your Majesty. The spice must flow, and the sea remembers only those voices which claim it with strength." Now in his 50s, with silver at his temples and scars on his heart, Vasco da Gama readied himself for a second voyage eastward. But this time there would be no festival, no procession of cheering crowds. The mood had shifted. Portugal now moved with purpose, no longer naive, but sharpened by the blade of commerce. His fleet, larger and more intimidating than before, bore not just sailors and merchants, but cannon, soldiers, and scribes. The mission was transformation, not diplomacy. Gone were the tentative overtures of cloth and crosses. Now came the unmistakable scent of empire. As the ships unfurled their massive sails into the dawn-bound blue, the chants of priests whispered behind them. And da Gama, his hands behind his back, sea cloak rustling, watched Lisbon dwindle into horizon haze. He knew that what he was about to do would mark him both a legend and a villain, depending on who told the tale. But hesitation was a luxury he could no longer afford. Months later, the coast of India unfurled like an old acquaintance. But this time, Vasco did not approach as a stranger bearing offerings. He arrived beneath the banner of retribution. Calicut had betrayed him, he believed. The confusion of his first visit, rumors of intrigue, and the humiliation of Portuguese terms being rejected had fermented into a desire for dominance. Now, with Portuguese ships stationed along the western coast, he demanded compliance. His arrival in Calicut was met with both fear and bitter remembrance. The Zamorin's court, although changed, still bore the pride of its heritage. But this time da Gama did not kneel. He did not request audience. He issued commands. When negotiations stalled, he ordered cannon fire on the harbor. Flaming shots screamed through the air. Ships burned. Civilians died. Screams rang out over the surf like the sea was mourning itself. Vasco stood firm, his officers behind him frozen in disbelief. Had diplomacy failed, or had it ever existed to begin with? Captain Jorge Alvarez, one of his chief lieutenants, turned to him after the smoke cleared. "My lord, was this truly necessary?" Da Gama's face remained cold. "Trade is founded not on prayers, Captain, but on iron. They must learn the difference." For weeks the Portuguese tightened their grip. Fortresses rose from the sands in stone and mortar, carved by unwilling hands. Alliances were formed with rivaling rulers who saw in the Portuguese not oppressors, but perhaps opportunity. Christians in India, Nestorians and Syrians welcomed these Europeans as liberators or brothers, yet to others the invaders bore the face of wrath. Vasco made his base in Cochin, a city more amenable to Portuguese interest. Here, surrounded by spice warehouses and garrisons of well-paid mercenaries, he spun his web. Trade flourished under his rule, saffron and pepper flowing westward in increasing measure. But so did resentment. A local interpreter, a man named Arvind, walked beside Vasco in the courtyard of his compound. The sun painted golden lines across the smooth stone. "They whisper many names for you," Arvind said quietly. "Some call you Vishakarta, the poison builder." Vasco studied the man. "And do they fear me?" Arvind nodded. "Yes, but not all who fear you will kneel." A silence fell like dust. Then da Gama replied, voice like wind over stone, "Let them stand then. The sea will not weep for their defiance." Despite the harshness of his actions, Vasco also brought structure to the chaos. He established maritime laws, codified trade practices between Portuguese and Indian merchants, and appointed trusted lieutenants to manage affairs. In many ways, he was an architect of a new order in the Indian Ocean, one of brutal effectiveness and unrivaled reach. But empire, like the sea, had its tides. In Portugal, power had shifted with the changing monarch. King Manuel had died, succeeded by Dom João III, a younger king with different visions. Rumors of abuses in India reached Lisbon. Tales of massacres, unjust taxes, and rebellion stirred by heavy-handed governance. The crown decided to act, and in 1524 Vasco da Gama was once again summoned, but not merely as a commander. He was appointed Viceroy of India, charged with restoring decorum and rooting out corruption festering within the very system he had helped to build. Vasco set sail once more, this time aboard his final ship, aware that few men steer fate twice. His health was failing, rheumatism plagued him, and his once proud stride had slowed to a dignified limp. But his mind remained sharp, and his sense of duty burned hot. In Cochin, now the headquarters of Portugal's eastern possessions, Vasco set up court. He investigated corrupt governors, disciplined soldiers who had grown soft with power, and reinstated order. He was both admired and feared. But the toll was heavy. One evening, as monsoon clouds gathered over the horizon and the sea turned a steely gray, Vasco da Gama sat beneath the fronds of a palm tree overlooking the beach. His son, Estevan da Gama, now a man and officer himself, approached and knelt beside him. "You should rest," Estevan whispered. "The future is in hands like mine now." Vasco's eyes stayed fixed to the horizon. "The future never waits, my son. And the sea asks no one's permission to change." A week later, in the humid air of December 1524, in a room adorned with both crucifixes and trade maps, Vasco da Gama breathed his last. He died a world away from the scent of his mother's kitchen, from the chapel of his youth, from the cliffs of the Atlantic. Cochin officials observed mourning rites. A foreign city mourned a foreign man, half conqueror, half commander, wholly woven into its fate. His body, preserved in a leaden coffin, was eventually returned to Portugal, where it was interred with all the grandeur befitting a royal hero. Cathedral bells pealed as dignitaries remembered the admiral who had brought the world closer and shaken its very foundation. Today his name adorns plaques, cities, and schools. Statues of him point always eastward, as though his eyes still scan distant shores. But his legacy does not rest easily. To some, Vasco da Gama opened doors to prosperity. To others, he opened wounds that bled for generations. The bridge he built between Europe and the East was gilded in spices, but also stained with fire. Historians debate his merit. Was he driven by faith or greed? Was he a man of his time or an early herald of oppression? Each chronicle offers different truths, yet one truth stands above all. He dared. When others clung to coastlines, he veered into empty ocean. When customs resisted, he imposed new ones. When the limits of the known world dared him to advance, he stared into the dark swell and commanded, "Sail!" And so, in the eternal rhythm of the tide, when stars glisten above ocean's breath and the wind hums old songs, those who listen closely might still hear the echo of sails, stitched with ambition,